Hello guys, so we are continuing on with the endocrine system. Last time we talked about hormones and we talked about it in sort of a generic generalization way. And so we talked about the two different types of hormones. We have water-soluble hormones and lipid-soluble hormones. We also talked about some of the ways that hormone levels are going to be regulated. So we talked about negative feedback loops. And so a lot of that information is going to come again today. So today's focus is not just what you learned last time, but also trying to fill it in with some of the specific endocrine glands and the specific hormones and the actions and the interactions between those different hormones. So really focus on relationships between hormones and their glands. Okay. So first of all, what is an endocrine gland? Remember, those are glands in the body that secrete hormones, and those hormones are going to be secreted into the bloodstream. They'll travel around in the bloodstream until they find their target cell, and it'll know it's a target cell because it has a specific receptor that has the correct binding site that fits into the shape of the hormone. Okay, so we're going to talk about quite a lot of different endocrine glands today. This lecture piece is going to focus on the anterior and posterior pituitary. We'll talk about the master gland. Then we'll talk about the thyroid and parathyroid and the adrenal gland. And then we'll talk about the pancreas and some miscellaneous other pieces such as the pineal gland, which is located right there in the brain. Okay, into the pituitary. So here, if you're looking in the brain, okay, so here's the brain. This is called the diencephalon, and it has the thalamus and the hypothalamus underneath it. And then the pituitary gland is going to stick out from that. It's connected by a little stalk, which is called the infundibulum. The pituitary gland has two functionally different regions. So you have the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, and both of them secrete different hormones. So it's important, I would kind of just sort of think of them as different separate glands. Now, one thing that I do think that is important to understand is the anterior pituitary is controlled by the hypothalamus, but it's going to produce and secrete its own hormones, while the posterior pituitary, all it is sort of like a storage area for hormones that are actually produced by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus produces these hormones, and then they're just sort of stored in the posterior pituitary until secretion. Okay, so the hypothalamus makes the ones that are secreted from the posterior pituitary. Okay, looking at the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary secretes a bunch of different hormones. Most of those hormones are tropic hormones. Do you remember what that means? Tropic hormones. That means that they control the activity of other hormones. Okay, so here's the anterior pituitary. It'll secrete those tropic hormones, for example, gonadotropins. They regulate the activity of other endocrine glands, in this case, the gonads here, and that will help regulate the levels of other hormones. Okay, so those are going to be involved in negative feedback loops to help maintain specific hormone levels. Okay, so here is the giant list of those hormones produced by the anterior pituitary. And I know that at first it's going to feel overwhelming because it's like a whole bunch of things at once. But if you really start to look at the names here, the names generally tell you the function. Okay, so it's not nearly as bad as it feels when you first look at this slide. Okay, so for example, growth hormone, that's for growth. Okay, so it'll go to multiple parts of the body, the skeletal muscles, the bones, and it's going to trigger and stimulate growth in the body. Then we have the thyroid stimulating hormone. It does exactly what it says. It stimulates the thyroid, and it's going to cause the thyroid to secrete a different hormone, which is called thyroxine. We're going to come back to that one as well. Okay, so thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid. Then we have the adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. ACTH. that, again, scary sounding name, but it really is just describing what it does. It's a hormone that goes to the cortex. Cortex means the outside part of the adrenal gland, and it's a tropic hormone, so it's going to stimulate the secretion of a different gland, a different hormone, such as cortisol or aldosterone. Okay, so it's a tropic hormone that goes to the adrenal cortex and causes it to secrete some other hormone. Then we have follicle-stimulating hormone. The follicle-stimulating hormone, and that one, you need a little story behind that. Inside the ovaries, you have these little circular structures that are called follicles, and the eggs, the oocytes, are going to mature inside of the follicles. And so what the follicle-stimulating hormone does in females is it stimulates the egg and follicle maturation, and then that will then in turn increase the amount of estrogens produced in the body. We'll go through that in a lot more detail when we get to the reproductive system at the end of this semester. Now, the luteinizing hormone, it's related to another circular structure in the ovaries. Sorry, in the ovaries. It's going to cause secretion and ovulation of the oocyte that matured in the follicle. And once the follicle loses its egg, it becomes a corpus luteum. So it luteinizes the follicle to become the corpus luteum. And then prolactin, lactate as in milk. Okay, so prolactin, that's going to stimulate milk production. Okay, sorry, big old long list. Needs some practice. Let's go through some of those. So just to remind yourselves, the tropic hormone, that means that it's a hormone that's going to regulate the activity of another hormone. And so generally what happens is the tropic hormone stimulates that second hormone, and then in turn, that second hormone inhibits the tropic hormone. And that's where you create those negative feedback loops to prevent changes in hormone levels. Okay, so let's give you some specific examples now. We've talked about this already. Now let's really get to it so we understand it. So remember that the anterior pituitary, it might be the master gland, which means that it controls the other endocrine glands, but it has a king. That's what I like to think of it. And so the king of everything would be the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is going to control the anterior pituitary. It does that by releasing its own tropic hormone, which is called a own hormone. Whenever you see RH in a hormone stands for releasing hormone. All of the releasing hormones come from the hypothalamus. Okay, so if you ever see something with an RH in it, that's releasing hormone, and it comes from the hypothalamus. So for example, the hypothalamus is going to release gonadotropin releasing hormone, and it does exactly what it sounds. It goes to the anterior pituitary and it causes it to release a gonadotropin. In this case, they would be follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Both of those will be secreted into the bloodstream, and once they're in the bloodstream, they'll travel around until they get to the gonads. The gonads will be where the receptor will be found. And these are steroid hormones. Do you remember what that means? It means that they are lipid soluble. And if they're lipid soluble, where is that receptor going to be found? Inside of the cell. So those steroids will go in, and that what it's going to do is that going to trigger the release of estrogens or androgens, depending on male versus female. Okay, so again, those will go on and do all their normal activities. So, for example, testosterone makes you hairy. It, increases muscle mass. It increases the red blood cell count, so increases hematocrit, things like that. But the other thing that it does is it helps regulate itself in the negative feedback loop. So this estrogen or the androgens, they're going to come back then and then negatively inhibit both the anterior pituitary as well as the hypothalamus. Okay, so they'll wander around and they're going to inhibit both of them, which means you have reduced amount of gonadotropin releasing hormone and reduced amount of gonadotropin, so less FSH and less LH, and the net result would help reduce the amount of the estrogens or the androgens, right? So again, don't forget that the main point of all of this is to make sure to keep the levels fairly consistent, keeping those levels the same. Okay, so I really want you to understand the relationships between the different hormones, right? So the gonadotropin releasing hormone stimulates the gonadotropins. The gonadotropins stimulate the sex hormones, but then the sex hormones inhibit both of those. Okay, so you got that negative inhibition. Okay, on to the posterior pituitary. So remember that the posterior pituitary, it's more like a storage area. Think of like the gallbladder. That's what I think of. Goes back to the gallbladder. The gallbladder stores the bile, but it doesn't make the bile. For the posterior pituitary, the hypothalamus is going to produce those hormones. Then they'll go to the posterior pituitary where it'll store it until it is needed. And the two hormones that are needed from the posterior pituitary are the antidiuretic hormone and then oxytocin. So let's start with ADH. So if you think about this, your understanding of this really comes down to whether or not you've heard the word diuretic. So do you know what a diuretic is? Diuretic is something that makes you pee. For example, you can say that caffeine is a diuretic because it makes you have to go pee. So if a diuretic makes you pee, what is an antidiuretic? It stops you from peeing. So what it does is it promotes water absorption back into the body so that as things are flowing through the nephron in the kidneys, it's going to reabsorb more of the water back into the body, which means that you have less of it coming out in the urine. Okay, so that's just going to help maintain body blood fluids, which will help maintain blood pressure as well. Okay, so that's the antidiuretic. It's against peeing. It conserves the water. Oxytocin is a little bit more complicated. Oxytocin is a hormone that is released, it's called the bonding hormone because it's released when you have positive touch that you like. So this could be like a nice hug, pat on the back, good handshake, and it's going to be released and it helps strengthen bonds. And it also has some more specific functions, such as during birth, what happens is you release the oxytocin, and then the oxytocin causes contractions of the uterus. And so what you have is a positive feedback loop where you have more and more and more oxytocin. So you get stronger and stronger and stronger contraction of the uterus, and that's how you get, you give birth. And then the other thing that it has to do with is milk ejection, because in the mammary glands, you have smooth muscles surrounding the milk glands. And what happens is when the oxytocin stimulates that smooth muscle, that's going to contract the smooth muscle, and that's going to cause the milk to flow out through the nipple. So really this one here is, so remember that prolactin, which is produced by the anterior pituitary, that is going to make the milk in the first place, but the oxytocin is how you get the milk out. So for those of you who've ever done breastfeeding, sometimes they refer to this as the let down. So your breasts sort of feel heavy and then the milk will start flowing out. That's by the oxytocin. Now remember that oxytocin is released by positive touch, right? So the milk let down comes from the suckling of the baby, right? So as the baby is suckling and especially touching the mother, that's going to trigger the oxytocin. You'll get more and more oxytocin, and that'll cause stronger and stronger contractions of the smooth muscle around the milk glands, and that's what causes the milk let down and the milk to flow. Okay, so which hormone produces the milk in the first place? That would be prolactin, which comes from the anterior pituitary. And then which hormone stimulates the milk ejection? That would be the oxytocin, which comes from which is secreted from the posterior pituitary. Okay, so we got this wonderful positive feedback loop. The more suckling, the more the milk will flow out, and the more milk that flows out, the more the hypothalamus stimulates for the production of prolactin, the more milk it would have. So this is a great system to make sure that the baby gets just as much milk as it needs, but no more. So it's a really good positive thing. So if you are breastfeeding, make sure that you do very regular feedings so that you can continue to make lots of prolactin and therefore lots of oxytocin too. Okay, that's enough for now. I'm going to stop it and you go on to the adrenal gland.